Well, let's get into, I want to talk to you guys about how to map out your how to manage your waypoints for marking schools of fish and how to set up your boat. Because I've been getting asked the question quite a bit online lately on live streams. How do you position your boat on a point? How do you position your boat on an offshore school of fish to catch them? And that is about as complicated of a question as you could ask me. There's so many aspects to that, from the shape of the structure, the shape of the school, the wind direction, the bait I'm gonna throw. Like, there's so many aspects to how I'm gonna set my boat up. So this can be a hump, this can be a row bed. I just drew a really simple point, and I drew two lines here. So typically when you fish a piece of offshore structure, you're gonna have a bottom depth and a top depth. For me, I wanna have a bottom depth and a top depth. So like out here lately, kind of my top depth here lately, most of the time has been about 15, no more than 12 foot on the shallow side, and about 20 is where I've been on the deep side out here. Now, if I start marking fish out deeper off the structure, then I'll look deeper. But we'll just call this 15 to 20 just to keep things really simple for this purpose, okay? So this inside line is gonna be 15 foot. And the outside line is gonna be 20 foot. So that means the area of this point that I need to graph is all in this lane right here, okay? That's where I need to graph. Now, my highest percentage area and where I really want to see the fish set up is somewhere out here on the end. It doesn't mean they can't set up over here. And if I'm having a day where I've ran 5 or 6 or 8 or 10 of these points or structures and I'm not finding them out here on the spot where I want them to be, now I'm going to have to take my time and start graphing more of it. But for this purpose, we're going to say that we see some out here, right? So when I start graphing this is how I'm going to do it. I like to work out to end. You can work from up here to down. You can work shallow to deep or deep to shallow, it doesn't matter. But I'm going to come here with my boat and I'm going to make a line like this. I'm going to zigzag that structure. If you guys ever seen me on the water in summertime, you'll see me doing that. Turning my boat around doing that, right? We all do it, right?
Oh, yeah.
Now, that's how I like to do it. Now, let's say, and I mark a fish icon every time I mark bass. Even if it's 1, even if it's 2 or 3, I'm gonna mark a fish icon on that fish, even if it's just 1. So I marked a fish here, and then I marked a little school of fish here, and then let's say I marked some over here, and here, and here, and here, and I got side imaging and down and sonar all going. So either side of me they're on, under me, I can see them everywhere. So let's say I marked all these fish out here, and I didn't mark any up here. Now I'm gonna take my boat, and I'm gonna come over here and I'm gonna go like this. I'm gonna go back through the school going this way. I really want to understand how wide and tall that school is. I want to know the exact shape of that school as far as if from a bird's eye view where they're positioned on that point. And I do more graphing than anybody else I know on schools of fish, because A, these fish will move on you a lot and I want to know where they're moving to. And B, I want to know exactly where that entire school of fish is, because sometimes this area may be 50 yards, sometimes it may be 100 yards, sometimes it might be 5 yards. So if it's 5 or 10 yards, well, we can make that cast right here in this one spot. But if I got a 100-yard school spread out on a long point, I need to know that I need to fish this section and this section and this section before I bail on it, right? So I come back through here and I mark a couple more fish here and here. Well, now as I look at this school is kind of in an oval, right? Well, that's easy. That means I can basically set up on this school of fish anywhere that I want to and really keep my bait in them pretty efficiently, okay? It kind of narrows down a little bit this way, so I'd probably want to set my boat up over here as long as it wasn't just a total wrong wind direction. And nowadays with spot lock, there's really not a wrong wind direction anymore, folks. You know what I mean? Like, because you can go to the back deck of the boat and leave your spot lock on. That's not a problem. You can do that. But let's say that this school was set up like this right here. So here's my school right here. Well, now the game's changed, because now I have 2 places I can set my boat up regardless of wind. I could set my boat up right here, and I can set my boat up right here and right here, because that school is elongated in that direction. See how it's longer on one side than the other? So if my school is set up more in a line across the structure, I want to set my boat up on one side of that line or the other so that I can keep my bait in that school the whole time I'm casting. And if I can cast all the way across the school, great, I can cover it all from one spot lock position. If this is too big of a school, then I can cast to the middle and bring it back. And once we're done there, we've caught them or we didn't catch them, we can move to the middle and cover the other half of the school. Now, I always want to try to throw with guide customers. I want to try to throw with the wind when I'm fishing offshore. Now, I've heard a lot of pros over the years talk about throwing into the wind, or throwing into the current. Like if they're fishing a river lake that has a lot of current, they want to throw into the current, because those fish are setting up with their nose into the current. So they want to throw into the current, bring the bait with the current coming back to the fish. We don't have real current on any of these fisheries around here. There's not river current on any lake around here. So you don't have to worry about, fish can set up however they want to. There's not strong enough current. I mean, yeah, we get some wind current out there, and sometimes they open the gates, but they're not, those fish can set up with their head any direction they want to. You have no way of knowing which direction their head's set up. What I want to do is I want to be able to make a long cast, because when you're fishing deeper water, 15, 20, 25 foot, it's important to get as long a cast out there as possible and get that bait down on the bottom for as long as possible. Whether it's a crankbait, a swim bait, it doesn't matter, a worm, a jig, you want that line down on the bottom in that school as long as possible. That's how you're going to increase your bites offshore. The number one way to increase the number of bites that you get on offshore schools is to keep your bait in front of one as long as possible. It's a bass is a bass is a bass, and when he's on a bed, the longer you keep that bait in his face right where he is, he's going to bite more often. Offshore, the longer you keep that bait in front of a fish, the more often you're going to get bit. That's just the bottom line of this game right here. So it's really important to me to map these schools out really, really well and set my boat up. So if I've got a wind direction, let's say I got a wind direction that's coming this way. Well, in this case, I'm going to choose this side because I can throw crosswind but slightly downwind. Now, if I've got a wind direction that's coming this way, I'm going to set up over here because I can throw more downwind. Same thing over here. If it's going this way, I would set up right here, and that would be more of a downwind direction. It just depends on which direction that wind's coming from on which side of the school that I set up on. So if I have a perfectly oval or circular shaped school of fish, I'm going to get on the upwind side, and we're going to stay on the back deck and throw right into them. You know, in the guides tournament video Wednesday before last, not 2 days ago when we did the cranking video cord, but the last Wednesday before that, we had the Year Lake Fort Guide Invitational tournament that we were fortunate enough to come out with the win in that deal. And we got on two schools of offshore fish. And the first school we pulled up on, the wind was blowing right into that school of fish, right into that section of point that day. And you see, I had to turn the camera around to see my two guys catching them because our boat was facing into the wind on spot lock, and we were throwing with the wind right into that school. And I think that's really important. You want to get a lot of line out when you're fishing offshore. So I mark everything. I mark what I do personally because I can pretty well tell the difference between bass and other species on my graph. And I love Lowrance for this reason. Cody don't like me telling all the secrets, man. That's what it is. So Lowrance has a big variety of waypoint icons that you can select. So when I mark bass on my graph, I use a green fish icon because bass are green fish. When I see sand bass or crappie or something that's not bass, I'll mark it with a pink fish icon. So when I get done graphing and I zoom out on my map, I can really get a good handle on, well, the bass were in this section and the sand bass were in this section, or whatever have you. But I know exactly where my fish are. I'm marking every single fish that I see on that structure and then setting my boat up where I can keep my bait. Throw it downwind if possible, crosswind when I have to. Never throw it into the wind if I can keep from it. But I can set my boat up where I can keep that bait in the school of fish. That's my whole goal. My whole goal is to know where the bass are on the structure and to keep my bait in that school of fish as long as possible. So it's really, I said it was multifaceted, and it is. I'll have to set up closer to the school if I'm throwing a 1/4 ounce Texas rig or a drop shot. I can set up further away from the school if I'm throwing a deep diving crankbait, because the last 15, 20 feet, 30 feet of that cast, that bait's coming out of the school anyway because it's going to start rising as it gets to the boat. So depending on what bait I'm throwing, that'll determine how far or close to the school I get on the edge of it. But the bottom line is it's just about mapping that school out and keeping the bait in them as long as possible. That's all I'm really trying to do. So as complicated as it is, as much as there is to it, it's really that simple in the end.
Do you ever get real sneaky and go shallow and throw deep? That's something I've found over the years of just fishing. Especially, I always feel like Carolina rigging was something. It's usually not as effective. I mean, it can still be really effective cranking, but you lose some of your cast. So, you know, like if you're throwing deep and trying to bring shallow, you lose a portion of your cast because you're just trying to get to it. But I found over the years, you know, fishing a worm or Carolina rig or drop shot or whatever.
If you're dragging uphill, you can feel better.
You can, you know, like I've gotten some spots to where maybe I could get up on the bank and not be taking waves over the front deck. I can go back up and put the poles down in the mud and make a bone cast out to 20, 30 foot of water. You know, obviously depending upon how long tapering your point or your hump is or whatever. But
so this point falls from here to here, right? It goes from 15 to 20 from here to here. So if I graph that school, to me it's all about how the school of fish is positioned.
Yeah.
That's my ultimate deciding factor, is how the school is positioned. That's what matters the most. So if this school is positioned like this, where it's more elongated going down the point, which is pretty common.
Yeah.
Pretty common on these points for the fish to elongate on the point like that. I'll set my boat up right up here and throw this way. If the wind's going anywhere from here to here, anywhere in here, if the wind's blowing any of these directions, right, I'm gonna set up over here and throw out deep and go shallow. And that is better for dragging. You can feel the bait better. You can feel the bottom contact, feel the bite better. At the end of the day, though, it's more important to me to keep my bait in the school and make a long cast and keep it in there as long as possible.
Yeah.
So if the wind's blowing any of these ways up here, then on that same school, my boat's going to park right here and cast up the ridge and come down.
I do stuff like that once in a while to be sneaky, just because, you know, you may have 10 boats come in before you and everyone sits up like that, and everyone may catch a fish or two out of it and start wearing them out.
Bro, and sometimes changing the angle of the cast,
it makes a huge difference. It can be.
It can. And you know, that's always kind of, to me, that angle of the cast deal, as far as should I cast from the side, should I cast from the long side, the short side, whatever. There's some randomness to that, to me, on any individual school. So what I like to do is put the odds in my favor. My way of doing that is to get the longest cast I can and get the bait in there as long as possible.
Yeah.
I'd rather do that for me than try to randomly go, well, maybe I ought to cast over here.
Yeah.
Now, have I pulled up on a school and I know they're there? Like, well, there's times when your graph lights up and you go, oh, they're here. Now, if I set up on them the way that I feel like I should on a school that I go, dang, they're here, and I don't get a bite, I'm going to change angles. And I may pull over and throw into the wind and throw. I'm going to do whatever I can. I'm going to change baits more often. I'm going to go through more baits, more boat positions, and more everything else when my graph lights up and I know they're there. I know we should catch them. We're going to spend more time on that. We're going to be more creative with how we fish them if we don't get bit. But usually when your graph lights up, it don't even matter where you set up. You throw in there and you catch them, usually when your graph lights up like that. But for sometimes out here on this lake, especially this lake, with the pressure they get, it can be something as a different angled cast.
Yeah.
It's just simple as that. You can really make a difference.
Crackhead out there making circles around the point, picking up rods every 5
And that's where we'll get a little random with it, because I've got all those icons marked on my graph, and when I mark them on the console, they show up on the front one with my Lawrence's. And so once I do that, we'll get on the trolling motor and fish it like it's an area. Speaking of that, that's another really big tip to me that took me a long time to learn. Back in 2011, when the lake got really low, it was one of the best things that ever happened to me. A, it taught me how to run around the lake, seeing all the timber as the lake got 8 foot low. But B, it forced me to really fish offshore structure the majority of the year. And growing up, where I grew up, we fished shallow. Back in them days, we didn't have the electronics we have now. We fished a lot of shallow dirt hole type of ponds and lakes. We just didn't have a lot of deep water lakes down there. But I had to learn to fish a ton of offshore structure throughout the vast majority of the year when Lake Fork was 8 foot low. There was nothing shallow to fish. So when it wasn't spring, them fish, in fall, a little bit of shallow fish in the fall back then, but when it wasn't spring or fall, them fish were off the bank, dude. So most of the year I was out there. And this took me a long time to learn when I was doing that, because Lake Fork kind of spoiled me in 2011, because when it was that low, the fish were so condensed, you could just run around till you grabbed a mega school, and as soon as you threw in there, you really caught them. That happened a lot. But as the lake filled back up and I stayed with that offshore structure stuff, I started learning, okay, when these schools don't have as many fish in them, because now there's more fish living shallow because there's more stuff to live in. There's times when you got to fish an offshore piece of structure, a roadbed, a point, a dam, whatever it is. You got to fish it like it's an area. And not just, when those fish were so condensed, I would graph till I found the mega school and then make one cast. And that's the cast we'd catch them on until we were done catching, we move on. And that's great when it happens like that. And it still happens like that offshore. But a lot of times, the best offshore fishermen will take a long point or just a long, big deep water flat or something where they're finding some fish, and they'll fish that like it's an area. and they'll be more patient than the rest of us are on that area. They'll stay there longer, and they'll really milk that area, and they'll figure out how to get. Because guys, you got to remember in this game, we're just looking for 5. You know what I mean? Most of us, when we're out here, we're just looking for 5. Yep. We don't have to run and gun until we find a school we can catch 30 out of.
Nope.
We can grind 2 bites off of this spot and 2 bites off of that spot. And those guys that are making 1 cast, they don't bite, they're leaving. They're not getting those 2 bites that other guy got by staying there and fishing it like an area.
Yep.
So if you treat offshore structure more like you treat shallow water, you'll catch more fish on your slower days.
Mm-hmm. And usually better quality fish.
Yes, yes. And now, your days where you pull up and you're graphing big schools and they're biting, don't waste time in an area then. Like on the days where they're grouping up and you're really catching them, don't do that then. But more days than not, we got to make them bite. They ain't just feeding. More days than not, we got to make them bite. And when you're graphing fish and having a hard time catching them, be a little more patient. Fish it more like a shallow water pocket like you would in the springtime. If you put into a shallow water pocket in the springtime and didn't get a bite in 15 minutes, would you leave? No. You're going to stay there at least probably an hour, right? If you're in a pocket, you're going to fish that pocket out. You're going to slow down and wacky worm it. You're going to throw a square bill and bounce it off a stump, throw a top water. You're going to change bait. You're going to fish that area thoroughly. Do that same thing offshore. That was something that took me personally a long time to learn, that it's not just about graphing the fish and casting right there and you're going to catch them every time. Sometimes you have to expand and fish the area more thoroughly offshore, just like you do up shallow when they're not biting. Yeah. It's great when you pull into a pocket and they bite a frog every 5 casts. That's awesome. They don't always do that.
No.
And you have to expand and learn how to catch them. Same thing with offshore.
Yeah, I mean, like a lot of times when I do that, like you said, you'll mark them and they don't want to bite. You know, I may start out, something I love to do, you know, throwing the big plug. Start out like in the spot where you know, like, all right, I caught him here.
There's a sweet spot.
You know, I caught him here last week. I know exactly where to set up. I'm going to make my cast. I'm going to work on them for a little bit, let them settle down. They ain't biting, and I'm going to slowly work parallel to that point, varying my cast, and pretty much work all the way around it, you know, to where you're making all those different casts with that one plug, and you get all the way around to the backside of it. You can still see the fish on your 360 or your side scan or whatever. You're like, all right, they don't want the big plugs. So then you pick up the Carolina rig and work it back around. You know, I do that a lot, you know, where I'll run. I may have 5, 6, 7, 8 rods on the deck, and I might run through a majority of them unless I got ones like a frog or something. But, you know, like you're going to like run the Carolina rig all the way around. You eventually you'll find that one, you might, a swim bait sitting here. Yeah. And they may, you know, they might be moving with you, you know. You know, they might be going up, going down, depending on, you know, I see that a bunch, you know, because the bait will get up above them suspended, and those fish are staying below them, and as that bait moves around, it's just like a game of chess until you finally, the stars line up, and that one bait at the one right cast, and then you can just
it's no different
attention to where you do that cast, spot lock, and then you get them in a boat, and you can throw right back, all right, there's that dock perfectly in line with this stump, you can make that cast again, and a lot of times, like unless you just scatter them with the first cast, which usually doesn't happen but does from time to time, you'll get at least another 1 or 2 bites. Yeah,
changing those techniques, all that stuff is important. And I wanted to say that because I feel like it was a mistake that I made for so long offshore fishing, where when they just didn't bite the way I felt like they should bite, then I would just try to solve the problem by running to a new school. Go find another school that's better. And that was because I was spoiled because I was on this lake when it was low. When I started really learning how to fish offshore was when I was on this lake when it was really low. And at that time, you could just run till you found a better school because there were so many massive schools when the lake was so low. But just the other day when we were filming last week, at the end of last week, I had been catching all those fish on that point. Every one of them had been catching on a Carolina rig. Yeah. Every day we go in there, we're catching the fish on that point on a Carolina rig. And
I think we had a bite on the Carolina rig.
I was throwing a Carolina rig in there, never caught nothing. You were throwing a Carolina rig jig, and then you look down the bottom of my boat and you see that crankbait sitting there. You reach in there and tied that crankbait on, and boom, and you kind of got them going, caught like 4 in a row real quick on that crankbait. And that was a spot that had only been a 2 or 3 fish spot, so catching 4 was not bad. It was good. It wasn't a major school of fish on that point. We were only catching 2 or 3 a day, but every one we were catching was a big one.
Yeah, quality.
And same thing, you caught good quality on all 4 of them, but you picking up the crankbait and throwing it, which I wasn't even thinking about because I'd been on there for a week straight every day catching them on a Carolina rig. Yeah. So you just having that different approach and changing that bait changed that whole point for us that day. Yeah. And it can be that simple. It can really be that simple, little things like that. So that's how I do my boat positioning. I hope, was that good? Did that answer your question? Does anybody have any questions?
The pond dam over here on Fish Life, how do you graph that? And I don't know, you know, it's just, they're kind of confusing the fish sometimes as far as
Yeah, because so some of those pond dams, like the tops of them get so high, you're not fishing the top of it. You know, for me on that pond dam over here, it's about, what is it on top, about 7-10 foot, something like that. So I'm really not looking for fish on top. Every once in a while you'll see some on top of it, but more often than not, when you graph that pond dam, and this is going to be like I'm looking at a sonar right here, y'all. So it's going to look just like the point, but this is a pond dam looking down on it on sonar. So you're coming along, that pond dam comes up and goes down. And up here it's like 7 foot. And down here it's 20 something. We'll just call it 20. But a lot of times where I'm going to see those fish, especially when the wind's blowing into it, you're going to see those fish down here, right at the base of it. And then there's some timber out here in front of it, right? There's standing timber out here. And they'll be usually scattered between that timber and where that pond dam lifts up. Those fish, it's going to depend on how I mark them. If so, on my map, that pond dam runs across here. And then we got our other contour lines out here, right? So on that map, I'm going to mark those fish between the base of the pond dam and the timber line. We'll just call this the timber line. So if I mark those fish and they're like this, same principle, right? I'm either going to set up here or I'm going to set up here. Does that make sense? So I'm going to cast parallel to the pond dam at the base of it, whatever depth they're in, whatever section they're in. If they're stretched out, elongated along that pond dam at the base of it, I'm going to still keep my bait in that school as long as possible. But sometimes, and I've seen this, they'll, on that pond dam in particular, there's like a couple little sections of it they really like to get on more than the rest. They really don't spread out along that pond dam like that very often. Every once in a while they will, but not very often. There's a couple little sweet spots, and I'm almost sure that it's shell bed related, where that's where the plankton tends to gather, that's where the bait tends to gather, that's why the shell's there, and when the bait's there, that's why the bass are there. So a lot of times what you'll have is you'll have fish on that pond dam kind of like this. Right, and here will be the base, and here will be the timber line. Well, in this situation, depending on wind direction, I'm going to set my boat up over here or over here. I really like to set my boat up over here in the timber, if I can at all, and throw up to the pond dam and drag down it, just so I don't have to deal with fishing in that timber. If I set my boat up here at the top of the pond dam and throw out into the timber to get past the school, now I got to deal with potential hang-ups and customer hang-ups, and you know how that goes. So I really would rather set my boat up on that pond dam and throw to the pond dam and drag down. And usually you'll have, there's a section in the middle where they'll stack up, and then there's right over here in the corner they'll stack up. Right where that corner, where that point comes out to meet that pond dam, that's where they'll set up most of the time on that particular pond dam. But either way, they tend to set up like this, and when they do, I'm setting my boat up on the long side of the school no matter what, at all times. And then if they are set up this way, I set my boat up that way. Does that make sense? So it's really just, I'm just graphing all the fish I can and looking at the shape of the school, looking at the wind. That's how I'm doing it.